Some Terms of Thought in Modern Philosophy. Essay number 1. Locke and the Frontiers of Common Sense. Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Some Terms of Thought in Modern Philosophy. 5 essays by George Santayana. Essay number 1. Locke and the Frontiers of Common Sense. Paper read before the Royal Society of Literature on the occasion of the tercentenary of the birth of John Locke, with some supplementary notes. Part 2. It was characteristic of Locke's simplicity and intensity that he retained these insulated sympathies in various quarters. A further instance of his many-sidedness was his fidelity to pure intuition, his respect for the infallible revelation of ideal being, such as we have of sensible qualities or of mathematical relations. In dreams and in hallucinations, appearances may deceive us, and the objects we think we see may not exist at all. Yet in suffering an illusion we must entertain an idea, and the manifest character of these ideas is that of which alone, Locke thinks, we can have certain knowledge. These, he writes, are two very different things and carefully to be distinguished. It is being one thing to perceive and know the idea of white or black, and quite another to examine what kind of particles they may be, and how arranged, to make any object appear white or black. A man infallibly knows, as soon as ever he has them in his mind, that the ideas he calls white and round are the very ideas they are, and that they are not other ideas which he calls red or square. Thus the mind always perceives at first sight, and ever there happens any doubt about it, it will always be found to be about the names and not about the ideas themselves. This sounds like high Platonic doctrine for a philosopher of the left, but Locke's utilitarian temper very soon reasserted itself in this subject. Mathematical ideas were not only lucid but true, and he demanded this truth, which he called reality, of all ideas worthy of consideration. Mere ideas would be worthless. Very likely he forgot in his philosophic puritanism that fiction and music might have an intrinsic charm. Where the frontiers of human wisdom should be drawn in this direction was clearly indicated in Locke's day by Spinoza, who says, if in keeping non-existent things present to the imagination, the mind were at the same time aware that those things did not exist, surely it would regard this gift of imagination as a virtue in its own constitution, not as a vice, especially if such an imaginative faculty depended on nothing except the mind's own nature. That is to say, if this mental faculty of imagination were free. But Locke had not so firm a hold on truth that he could afford to play with fancy, and as he pushed forward the claims of human jurisdiction rather too far in physics, by assuming the current science to be literally true, so, in the realm of imagination, he retrenched somewhat illiberally our legitimate possessions. Strange that as modern philosophy transfers the visible wealth of nature more and more to the mind should seem to lose courage and to become ashamed of its own fertility. The hard-pressed natural man will not indulge his imagination unless it poses for truth, and being half aware of this imposition, he is more troubled at the thought of being deceived than at the fact of being mechanized or being bored, and he would wish to escape imagination altogether. A good God, he murmurs, could not have made us poets against our will. Against his will, however, Locke was drawn to enlarge the subjective sphere. the actual existence of mind was evident. You had only to notice the fact that you were thinking. Conscious mind, being thus known to exist directly and independently of the body, was a primary constituent of reality. It was a fact on its own accord. Common sense seemed to testify to this, not only when confronted with the "I think, therefore I am" of Descartes, but whenever a thought produced an action. Since mind and body interacted, each must be as real as the other, and, as it were, on the same plane of being. Locke, like a good Protestant, felt the right of the conscious inner man to assert himself, and when he looked into his own mind he found nothing to define this mind except the ideas which occupied it. The existence which he was so sure of in himself was therefore the existence of his ideas. Conscious mind was a fact on its own accord. The conscious mind was a man's moral being, and personal identity could not extend further than possible memory. This doctrine of Locke's had some comic applications. The Bishop of Worcester was alarmed. If actions which a hardened sinner had forgotten were no longer his, a short memory would be a great blessing in the day of judgment. On the other hand, a theology more plastic than Stillingfleet's would one day find in this same doctrine a new means of edification. For if I may disown all actions I have forgotten, may not things not done or witnessed by me in the body be now appropriated and incorporated into my consciousness, if only I conceive them vividly? The door is then open to all the noble ambiguities of idealism. As my consciousness expands, or thinks it expands, into dramatic sympathy with universal experience, that experience becomes my own. I may say that I have been the agent in all past achievements. Emerson could know that he was Shakespeare and Caesar and Christ. Futurity is mine also, in every possible direction at once, and I am one with the spirit of the universe and with God. Locke reassured the Bishop of Worcester, and was humbly confident that divine justice would find a way of vindicating itself in spite of human wit. He might have added that if the sin of Adam could not only be imputed to us jurisdictionally, but could actually taint our consciousness, as it certainly does if by Adam we understand our whole material heritage, so surely the sins done or the habits acquired by the body beyond the scope of consciousness may taint or clarify this consciousness now. Indeed, the idea we form of ourselves and of our respective experiences is a figment of vanity, a product of dramatic imagination, without cognitive import, save as a reading of the hidden forces, physical or divine, which have formed us and actually govern us. Mind and body interacted. The self which acts in a man is itself moved by forces which have long been familiar to common sense, without being understood except dramatically. These forces are called the passions, or, when the dramatic units distinguished are longish strands rather than striking episodes, they are called temperament, character, or will. Or perhaps, weaving all these strands and episodes together again into one moral fabric, we call them simply human nature. But in what does this vague human nature reside, and how does it operate on the non-human world? Certainly not within the conscious sphere or in the superficial miscellany of experience. Immediate experience is the intermittent chaos which human nature, in combination with external circumstances, is invoked to support and to rationalize. Is human nature, then, resident in each individual soul? Certainly. But the soul is merely another name for that active principle which we are looking for, to be the seat of our sensibility and the source of our actions. Is this psychic power, then, resident in the body? Undoubtedly, since it is hereditary and transmitted by a seed, and continually aroused and modified by material agencies. End of note. Since this soul or self in the body is so obscure, the temptation is great to dramatize its energies and to describe them in myths. Myth is the normal means of describing those forces of nature which we cannot measure or understand. If we could understand or measure them, we should describe them prosaically and analytically in what is called science. But nothing is less measurable or less intelligible to us, in spite of being so near to us and familiar, as the life of this carnal instrument, so soft and so violent, which breeds our sensations and precipitates our actions. We see today how the Freudian psychology, just because it is not satisfied with registering the routine of consciousness, but endeavors to trace its hidden mechanism and to unravel its physical cause, is driven to use the most frankly mythological language. The psychological processes concerned, though presupposed, are not on the scale of human perception and not traceable in detail, and the moral action, though familiar in snatches, has to be patched by invented episodes, and largely attributed to demonic personages that never come on the stage. Locke, in his Psychology of Morals, had at first followed the verbal rationalism by which people attribute motives to themselves and to one another. Human actions were explained by the alleged pursuit of the greater prospective pleasure and avoidance of the greater prospective pain. But this way of talking, though not so poetical as Freud's, is no less mythical. Eventual goods and evils have no present existence and no power. They cannot even be discerned prophetically, save by the vaguest fancy, entirely based on the present impulse and obsessions of the soul. No future good, no future evil awaits to move us, except, as Locke said after examining the facts more closely, when a certain uneasiness in the soul, or in the body, causes us to turn to those untried goods and evils with a present and living interest. This actual uneasiness, with the dream pictures which it evokes, is a mere symptom of the direction in which human nature in us is already moving, or already disposed to move. Without this prior physical impulse, heaven may beckon and hell may yawn without causing the least variation in conduct. As in religious conversion all is due to the call of grace, so in ordinary action all is due to the ripening of natural impulses and powers within the psyche. The uneasiness observed by Locke is merely the consciousness of ripening before the field of relevant action has been clearly discerned. When all this is considered, the ostensible interaction between mind and body puts on a new aspect. There are no purely mental ideas or intentions followed by material effects. There are no material events followed by a purely mental sensation or idea. Mental events are always elements in total natural events containing material elements also. Material elements form the organ, the stimulus, and probably also the object for those mental sensations or ideas. Moreover, the physical strand alone is found to be continuous and traceable. The conscious strand, the sequence of mental events, flares up and dies down daily, if not hourly, and the medley of its immediate features, images, words, moods, juxtaposes China and Peru, past and future, in the most irresponsible confusion. On the other hand, a human life is a part of the conscious element. Intentions, affectations, plans, and reasonings, that explains the course of action, dispersed temporarily, or dominant thoughts contain the reason for our continuous behavior and seem to guide us. They are not so much links in a chain of minute constructive causes. An idea or an act of will often takes time to work, and works, as it were, only posthumously, as they are general overarching moral inspirations and resolves which the machinery of our bodies executes in its own way, often rendering our thoughts more precious in the process, or totally transforming them. We do roughly what we meant to do, barring accidents. The reasons lie deep in our compound nature, being probably inarticulate, and our actions in a fragmentary way betrays our moral disposition, betrays it in both senses of the word betray, now revealing it unawares, and now sadly disappointing it. I leave it for the reader's reflection to decide whether we should call such cohabitation of the mind with body interactions, or rather sympathetic concomitance, self-annotation, and a partial prophetic awakening to a life which we are leading automatically. Here, by an insensible shift in the meaning of the word idea, a momentous revolution had taken place in psychology. Ideas had originally meant objective terms distinguished in thought images, qualities, concepts, propositions. But now ideas began to mean living thoughts, moments or states of consciousness. They became atoms of mind, constituents of experience, very much as material atoms were conceived to be constituents of natural objects. Sensations became the only objects of sensation, and the ideas the only objects of ideas, so that the material world was rendered superfluous, and the only scientific problem was now to construct a universe in terms of analytic psychology. Locke himself did not go so far, and continued to assign physical causes and physical objects to some at least of his mental units. And indeed, sensations and ideas could not very well have other than physical causes, the existence of which his new psychology was soon to deny, so that about the origin of its data it was afterwards compelled to preserve a discreet silence. But as to the combinations and reappearances, it was able to invoke the principle of association, a thread on which many shrewd observations may be strung, but which also, when pressed, appears to be nothing but a verbal mask for organic habits in matter. The fact is that there are two sorts of unobjectionable psychology, neither of which describes a mechanism of disembodied mental states, such as the followers of Locke developed into modern idealism, to the confusion of common sense. One unobjectionable sort of psychology is biological, and studies life from the outside. The other sort, relying on memory and dramatic imagination, reproduces life from the inside, and is literary. If the literary psychologist is a man of genius, by the clearness and range of his memory, by quickness of sympathy and power of suggestion, he may come very near to the truth of experience, as it has been or might be unrolled in a human being. The ideas with which Locke operates are simply highlights picked out by attention in this nebulous continuum, and identified by names. Ideas in the original ideal sense of the word are indeed the only definite terms which attention can be discriminate and rest upon. But the unity of these units is specious, not existential. If ideas were not logical or aesthetic essences, but self-sustaining feelings, each knowing itself, they would be insulated forever. No spirit could ever survey, recognize, or compare them, and mind would have disappeared in the analysis of mind. To the confusion of common sense. Berkeley and his followers sometimes maintain that common sense is on their side, that they have simply analyzed the fact of our experience of the material world, and if there is any paradox in their idealism, it is merely verbal and disappears with familiarity. All the reality, they say, all the force, obscurity, and fertility of nature subsist undiminished after we discover that this reality resides, and can only reside, in the fixed order of our experience. But no analysis of immediate experience will ever disclose any fixed order in it. The surface of experience, when not interpreted materialistically, is an inextricable dream. Berkeley and his followers, when they look in this direction towards nature and the rationale of experience and science, are looking away from their own system, and relying instead on the automatic propensity of human nature to routine, so that we spontaneously prepare for repeating our actions, not our experience, and even anticipate their occasions, a propensity further biased by the dominant rhythms of the psyche, so that we assume a future not so much similar to the past as better. When developed, this propensity turns into trust in natural or divine laws, but it is contrary to common sense to expect such laws to operate apart from the matter and from the material continuity of external occasions. This appears clearly in our trust in persons, a radical animal propensity, which is consistent with common sense when these persons are living bodies, but becomes superstitious, or at least highly speculative, when these persons are disembodied spirits. It is a pity that the beautiful systems of Berkeley should have appeared in an unspiritual age, when religion was mundane and perfunctory, and the free spirit, where it stirred, was romantic and wilful, for that system was essentially religious. It put the spirit face to face with God, everywhere, always, and in everything. It turned experience into a divine language, for the monition and expression of the inner man. Such an instrument in spiritual hand might have served to dispel all natural illusions and affections, and to disinfect the spirit of worldliness and egotism. But Berkeley and his followers had no such thought. All they wished was to substitute a social for a material world, precisely because a merely social world might make worldly interests loom larger, and might induce mankind, against the evidence of their senses and the still small voice in their heart, to live as if their worldly interests were absolute and must needs dominate the spirit. Morally, this system thus became to sanction a human servitude to material things, such as ancient materialists would have scorned, and theoretically the system did not escape the dogmatic commitments of common sense against which it protested. For far from withdrawing into the depths of the private spirit, it professed to describe universal experience and the evolution of all human ideas. The notion of experience originally presupposed a natural agent or subject to endure the experience and to profit by it, by learning to live in better harmony with external circumstances. Each agent or subject of experience might at other times become an object of experience also, for they all formed part of a material world which they might envisage in common with their perceptions. Now the criticism which repudiates this common material medium, like all criticism or doubt, is secondary and partial. It continues to operate with all the assumptions of common sense, save the one which it is expertly criticizing. So, in repudiating the material world, this philosophy retains the notion of various agents or subjects gathering experience, and we are not expected to doubt that there are just as many streams of experience without a world as there were people in the world when the world existed. But the number and nature of these experiences have now become undiscoverable. The material persons having been removed, who formerly were so placid as to gather easily imagined experiences, and to be able to communicate them; and the very notion of experience has been emptied of its meaning, when no external common world subsists to impose that same experience on everybody. It was not knowledge of existing experience in vacuo that led common sense to assume a material world, but knowledge of an existing world led it to assume existing, and regularly reproducible experiences. Thus the whole social convention posted by empirical idealism is borrowed without leave, and rests on the belief in nature for which it is substituted. Note. The literary psychologist may come very near to the truth of experience. Experience cannot be in itself an object of science, because it is essentially invisible, immeasurable, fugitive, and private; and although it may be shared or repeated, the evidence for that repetition or that unanimity cannot be found by comparing a present experience with another experience by hypothesis absent. Both the absent experience and its agreement with the present experience must be imagined freely and credited instinctively in view of the known circumstances in which the absent experience is conceived to have occurred. The only instrument for conceiving experience at large is accordingly private imagination; and such imagination cannot be tested, although it may be guided and perhaps recast by fresh observations or reports concerning the action and language of other people. For action and language, being contagious, and being the material counterpart of experience in each of us, may voluntarily or involuntarily suggest our respective experience to one another, by causing each to re-enact more or less accurately within himself the experience of the rest. Thus alien thoughts and feelings are revealed or suggested to us in common life, not without a subjective transformation increasing, so to speak, as the square of the distance; and even the record of experience in people's own words, when these are not names for recognizable external things, awakens in the reader, in another age or country, quite incommensurable ideas. Yet under favorable circumstances, such suggestions or revelation of experience, without ever becoming science, may become public unanimity in sentiment, and may produce a truthful and lively dramatic literature. All modern philosophy, in so far as it is a description of experience and not of nature, therefore seems to belong to the sphere of literature, and to be without scientific value. These considerations might enable us, I think, to mark the just frontier of common sense even in this debatable land of psychology. All that is biological, observable, and documentary in psychology falls within the lines of physical science, and offers no difficulty in principle; nor need literary psychology form a dangerous salient in the circuit of nature. The dramatic poet or dramatic historian necessarily retains the presupposition of a material world, since beyond his personal memory, and even within it, he has nothing to stimulate and control his dramatic imagination save knowledge of the material circumstances in which people live, and of the material expression in action or words which they give to their feelings. His moral insight simply vivifies the scene that nature and the sciences of nature spread out before him. They tell him what has happened, and his heart tells him what has been felt. Only literature can describe experience, for the excellent reason that the terms of experience are moral and literary from the beginning. Mind is incorrigibly poetical, not because it is not attentive to material facts and practical exigencies, but because, being intensively attentive to them, it turns them into pleasures and pains, and into many-colored ideas. Yet at every turn there is a possibility and an occasion for transmuting this poetry into science, because ideas and emotions, being caused by material events, refer to these events and record their order. All philosophies are frail, in that they are products of the human mind, in which everything is essentially reactive, spontaneous, and volatile. But as in passion and language, so philosophy, there are certain comparatively steady and hereditary principles forming a sort of orthodox reason, which is or which may become the current grammar of mankind. Of philosophers who are orthodox in this sense, only the earliest or the most powerful, an Aristotle or a Spinoza, need to be remembered, in that they stamp their language and temper upon human reason itself. The rest of the orthodox are justly lost in the crowd and relegated to the chorus. The frailty of heretical philosophers is more conspicuous and interesting. It makes up the chronique scabuleuse of the mind, or the history of philosophy. Locke belongs to both camps. He is restive in his orthodoxy, and timid in his heresies, and like so many other initiators of revolution, he would be dismayed at the results of his work. In intention, Locke occupied an almost normal philosophic position, rendered precarious not by what was traditional in it, like the categories of subsistence and power, but rather by certain incidental errors, notably by admitting an experience independent of bodily life, yet compounded and evolving in a mechanical fashion. But I do not find in him a prickly nest of obsolete notions and contradictions, from which, fledged at last, we have flown to our present enlightenment. In his person, in his temper, in his allegiances and hopes, he was the prodigy of a race of philosophers native and dominant among people of English speech, if not in academic circles, at least in the national mind. If we make allowance for a greater personal subtlety, and for the difference and perplexities inevitable in the present moral anarchy of the world, we may find this same Lockean eclecticism and prudence in the late Lord Balfour, and I have myself had the advantage of being the pupil of a gifted successor, in many ways emulator of Locke, I mean William James. So great at bottom does their spiritual kinship seem to me to be, that I can hardly conceive Locke vividly without seeing him as a sort of William James of the 17th century. And who of you has not known some other spontaneous, inquisitive, unsettled genius, no less preoccupied with the marvellous intelligence of some Brazilian parrot than with the sad obstinacy of some Bishop of Worcester? Here is the eternal freshness of conviction and ardour for reform, great keenness of perception in spots, and in other spots lacunae and impulsive judgments, distrust of tradition, of words, of constructive argument, horror of vested interests and their smooth defenders, a love of navigating alone and exploring for oneself even the coasts already well charted by others. Here is romanticism united with a scientific conscience and power of destructive analysis balanced by moral enthusiasms. Doubtless Locke might have dug his foundations deeper and integrated his faith better. His system was no metaphysical castle, no theological acropolis, rather a homely ancestral manor house built in several styles of architecture, a Tudor chapel, a Palladian front toward the new geometrical garden, a Jacobean parlour for political consultation and learned disputes, and even, since we are almost in the 18th century, a Chinese cabinet full of curios. It was an habitable philosophy, and not too inharmonious. There was no great incongruity in its parts than in the gentle variance of English weather, or in the qualified moods and insights of a civilized mind. Impoverished as we are, morally and humanly, we can no longer live in such a rambling mansion. It has become a national monument. On the days when it is open we revisit it with admiration, and those chambers and garden walks re-echo to us the clear dogmas and savoury diction of the stage. Omnivorous, artless, loquacious, whose dwelling it was. End of essay number 1, part 2.